If time matters, how can you transform your contract so that it is being signed by the customer much faster? I'd like to invite you to a journey. We will start with some pieces of paper called contract. We will move them through a cleanup exercise that I call contract detox. And then we will arrive at a place that is quite fascinating, where the customer can configure its contract. Let me start with a question. How often in recent years did a stranger ask you on the street, what is the time? While this is still a very popular question when you learn a new language, you may not need it because people have smartphones. But it's not only that. We see also a lot of behavioral changes through the use of technology. People don't ask people and wait for the answer if they have the ability to find the answer themselves through internet searches or listening to YouTube videos or TED Talks. In the last 20 years, I've been primarily a transactional lawyer, so I've negotiated, redlined, explained contracts to many customers. Now I look at contracts slightly differently. I do design them, I clean them up, I reshuffle the content so that it actually is tailor-made. It feels more like being a legal architect. My own transformation was not a wish for some personal development, but rather a necessity. I did recognize through a lot of negotiations that we very often are stuck in negotiations because we don't put the right paperwork in front of the customer that is tailored to its need. And rather than you end up in negotiations until you get to that point through negotiations and tailor the contract accordingly. I'm passionate about lean content, customized content that is consumable to the customer in the most efficient way. And this will happen through contract transformation as well as through the use of technology. Today, we don't have to put standard templates in front of the customer. We can also scale with custom-made contracts. If you think a customer that is first engaging with you, the first thing that happened there is that the customer very often gets a pile of paperwork from you and then is trying to figure it out. Contracts are often perceived to be very complex and long and something that only a lawyer is going to be able to understand. But the customer is not just comprised of lawyers, right? And it takes time for the customer to read through a lot of pages if you put a lot of pages in front of the customer. So each page of non-technical content is calculated to take 2.5 minutes. The more pages you have, the longer it's taking. And it also absorbs a lot of resources like trees. Each tree is calculated to equal about 8,500 pages. So if you reduced your contract by just 1 page, multiplied by the number of transactions you have, let's say in a quarter or in a year, and then divided by 8,500, assuming that your contract is being printed at least once, you will get a number of trees that you can save by just reducing the content by 1 page. My working assumption is that if the contract is understood by and meaningful to a customer, then the customer will sign it faster. My other assumption is that if the language you're using is not dreadful, but rather something that is appealing to and resonating with the customer, there will be less time to explain it to the customer. And the deal is closed faster. And we have it in our hands, right? We do craft contracts as lawyers, and we use the language in which we want to describe our products or services. So imagine how much time we can actually save and how much resources we can save if we have concise contracts that are easily understandable by the customer and consumable by the customer in an easy fashion. Let's start with restructuring our contract. And the overall goal would be that the contract is structured so that it can be read like a map. If the customer reads a contract and navigates through the contract, it wants to grasp its meaning, and basically if it likes what it reads, then it will sign quickly. But if it doesn't, then the whole world of negotiations as we know it will begin. And we want to avoid that if not necessary, right? So we should structure our contracts in a way that the customer can understand from its point of view. But there's no such thing like the customer. The customer has multiple stakeholders with different needs. So the business person needs to understand how you describe the products and services and whether those meet the requirements. The procurement person needs to understand the commercial terms and whether those are within the budget. The lawyer will look at the legal terms. So don't spread the legal terms and leave the legal traces all over the place if you want to avoid that the customer lawyer is reading or having to read everything. So you get it. There are multiple personalities that the customer has, and you need to design the contract to meet all their needs. You can think about it a little bit like the customer and all its stakeholders are on a journey. They may not all start at the same place and they may take different routes, but if you give them clear directions, they will arrive at the destination together as fast as possible. What we should also take into consideration when we restructure our contracts is to avoid what I would now call messy roads. So very often we throw in content that is legally not required to be executed by both parties. It may still be relevant to the contract in some sense or nice to have, but it may not be legally required to really be included. So if you want to save the reader some time, then shorten it. Shorten the contract and really avoid discussions about which terms really apply for the specific transactions if you have some boilerplate in your contracts. The final point I'd like to make on restructuring a contract is about using links. And I'd like to come back to the idea to create really a contract that can be read like a map. A map gives really clear directions, right? But if you point the customer through the use of links from one page to another document to some website, then the customer may very often feel like being in a roundabout without knowing which exit to take. And in this particular case, I think it will be quite helpful if you be quite careful about when and how to use links. And if you point them to websites where it is completely open what terms will become part of the contract and what will not. Don't get me wrong, links can be useful. For example, if you have dynamic content in the contract, which you know by its nature will change over the term of the agreement. But use the links wisely. So once you have really structured your content according to the target audiences, you have removed content that is not required, and then you have also used links wisely, then we can turn to the next point, which is really now that the customer persona has arrived at the content that it is supposed to have a look at, is the content clear enough for the customer to understand? So there have been lots of books written about plain legal language to use in contracts. So I trust you are on top of that, but I'd like to share some more ideas that are maybe also hopefully helpful for you. And one starts with a translation. So we often create templates in English first, and then we translate them. And what we have ignored so far is whether or not the use of certain terms and phrases in the English template creates some ambiguity in the translation process into certain languages. We now actively really try to avoid that and seek advice from our translators up front. What you can also use in order to improve the readability of your contracts is to use visualization techniques. So think about putting in a time scale into your contract as a picture if you have a lot of timelines included in a paragraph, so that the customer understands what will happen, who needs to provide notice when, and when is then the effective date of termination, and when is the data returned, and so on. And this is just one example, right? You could also use layering techniques, which basically are an additional layer that you put on top of the contractual language, but you use words in layman's terms so that also a non-lawyer can easily understand the meaning of a specific clause. To sum it up, language matters. So if you want to reach your target audience, you better speak their language to get your message across. Let me point now to the final item that I like to cover today, and that is the contract configuration idea. I'd like to invite you to a thought-provoking experiment. Typically, we really consume our contracts or ask our customers to consume our contracts by sending them a standard template, and then the customer redlines it and the negotiations start. But it doesn't have to be like that. So for example, if you want to buy a new car, you can go now to the internet, use the configuration tool, you add all the extras that you like, you can figure out then what it costs, and then you purchase the car as you design it. The same is true for configuring your cereal if you have specific nutrition needs. So you can remove ingredients or add them at your choice and then get the cereal delivered to you. But what really strikes me is, why don't we have such a tool also to configure a contract? A very practical example could be to use a configuration tool for assembling a non-disclosure agreement. Imagine that you provide your customer with a choice or a tool in which they can enter their name, address, the content of the confidential information shared, the purposes for which it's going to be shared. You may add some additional options like what applicable law could be selected, or in which language the non-disclosure agreement is going to be produced. And then the customer can generate the non-disclosure agreement with its tailored information and DocuSign it, all set. You could also think about configuration in the sense that for a complex contract, you may always add the very same terms and conditions after the customer asks for them. So you may have predefined fallback clauses that the customer could also select upfront. And some of them may come with an additional price, others may not. So you can give the customer the choice. You could also give them the choice to select already agreed general terms and conditions, or a data processing agreement that the parties have concluded before and that is also suitable for this new deal. And that would shorten really the time you need to negotiate a contract, wouldn't it? Or you have a broad product portfolio and can now think about deal-specific drafting by really slicing and dicing content so that you map certain additional clauses to some products. And only if and when the customer selects the product, these additional terms would be added to the contractual draft. So what that means is really there's a sheer potential to configure a contract. And these were just some examples that I've given to you. What it really means is that you change the role of the customer in this particular case. You change the way how the customer is consuming the information from you. Instead of being just a mere passenger, being quite passive on the journey to get to a final contract, you really turn the customer into the driver. The customer can define really the route to take and the destination it wants to land to. And you provide the framework for that. So the customer will be getting much faster to a tailor-made contract. And then you can review and discuss the contract with the customer. Isn't that exciting? So now we're at the end of the journey. What is the time? What is the time that you spend on transforming your contract, on simplifying the language, on restructuring it, on building a roadmap so that at the end of the day, the contract is easily understood by the customer like a map? In order for you to not be frightened, but rather look forward to the transformation, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Albert Einstein, who once said, "The only reason for time is so that everything doesn't happen at once." Good luck with your transformation, and thanks for the time listening.